Okay, this recording is going to be a little bit of an eccentric combination of a few topics, which I think actually do settle together, and it's valuable to see the explanatory combination of these things. So I'm going to talk about some narrative plots in series, like the latest season of Star Trek Discovery, of which I've seen the first two episodes of season 4, and I'm going to critique the writing of that show and the writing of the characters of that show. Um, and perhaps it's a bit early in the season to do that, but I think I can see a style which is fundamentally anyway. I'll get into psychoanalyzing the actual characters in the narrative, um, and then I also want to talk about politics and society in general, um, and illiberalism, essentially, how we are moving into an illiberal culture where essentially no one is an adult anymore. No one has real agency and responsibility. They're all just kind of amoeba floating around to sort of bump into one another as essentially their environment must reflect their individual psyche. I mean, in Star Trek Discovery season 4, there's this character which is meant to essentially be the kind of a representation of gender identity. Uh, uh, you know, it's essentially it's getting into transhumanism kind of territory and themes, um, because you can do that in sci-fi very easily because of technology, essentially. And it's a bit on the nose in terms of the kind of the propaganda for essentially who I really am on the inside, sort of thing. Um, and that kind of unilateral relativism, and essentially the importance of having that relativism respected by your environment and mirrored back to you, that essentially that you can just perform and then your environment should receive your performance and should validate it, and that should be the source of self-esteem, is in a kind of codependency with you within the narrative of your life. And essentially the feedback that you get is essentially that there must be a collective responsibility to upkeep a good narrative. Obviously, this problem is that you can never ground what would make the narrative good or not. It's like, what are you comparing it with when you're talking about narratives, and you already have that disembodied perspective over life. Um, you have no basic grounding, and so because essentially you have no bootstrapping apparatus within your agency, you're always a child of the system, a child of the plot, a child of the unfolding narrative. And essentially, when you get negative feedback from other people surrounding you, um, it weirdly is just a reflection of the fatalism of your unfolding life. It's not something to be digested or processed or something like that. Um, it really is the model of a cultural system that doesn't have integrity, that doesn't have individuals with individual understanding and integrity and individual self-esteem. Self-esteem is a commodity of a kind of trust, and so sort of that and what gives this trust commodity or value, uh, is left ungrounded. And so the whole story essentially has this glaring lack of, essentially it's always just moving so quickly that the plot then, so you have to be carried by the next grand threat or the next existential cataclysm or something like that, because it's not, the plot does not unfold from a character driven It's not nestled within any of the characters. It's not character-driven plot. It's plot ensconced character, and that's necessary because they have no fundamental grounding within their own self-esteem and within their own integrity. They don't. All the characters are children. They're sort of orphans waiting to be adopted by the tempo of the surrounding conditioning and the surrounding conflation of a kind of just putting everything into a grand plot, which is why essentially they can only explore issues which are sort of cataclysmic, systemic, world-ending, grand threats. No individual bespoke stories, because there's nothing character driven, essentially, all children. Now this is the kind of media which one applies to a proto-fascistic culture. This is the identitarian gruel that is being, the narrative that is being pandered to people through this kind of writing. um, and you can see that they're really, the characters themselves are so sort of fickle and feeble in this, essentially this ravenous status game of adequacy in terms of self-esteem, and essentially nestling that self-esteem within some kind of rational coherence within their utilitarian function within the plot. you know and that kind, I mean, that's how fascists think about things. That's the kind of quantitative rationalization, um, that, because in some sense, as long as you're doing something that's efficacious, that is representative of some kind of grand existential insurance policy for your team or your group or something like that. um, and essentially your group is only good because it does something good for your relativism, because it guarantees you a ticket to have your relative subjective feelings be bestowed within a sociological symbol or badge of integrity. And so essentially it's this displacement of integrity with trust. And so, all these individuals don't really have the capacity, um, to, so they only fight over what is trustworthy and what is untrustworthy. That's essentially the general theme of the whole show. It's a kind of sociological political shouting match between characters about what is a greater symbolic effigy of trust, what is a greater a token, icon, idolatry, that their whole structure can be orientated around, um, and grounded by. So essentially, they're always just sort of chasing after trust credentials in some sense. Anyway, there's a parallel between this and the liberal. I mean, journalists were essentially radicalized into proto-fascism by identity politics. They got used to selling and peddling narratives of systemic oppression, which then creates the context within which people can mount in a liberal worldview, and when essentially they can turn the phrase robust debate into a euphemism that just means something disgusting. It just means, now that they can put their skeptical accusations that are uh, uh, that have built in unprincipled presuppositions that are all based on group guilt and finding a kind of representative scapegoat, uh, to be blamed for the sin of the systemic oppression. So it has this sort of this basic morally conflating expedient. So it's a kind of, it's a, I mean, this is why it is correct to call them hysterical, is because they are creating this false expediency which has all these necessary outcomes of essentially, unaccountable decision-making processes. There's such irregular ad hoc decision-making and criteria that is used that has this kind of built-in special treatment over their category system of identities and double standards between this category system, that then they can't uh, they can't do anything other than continue to sort of double down and continue on rationalizing the use of those double standards, and to find more divisive ways of anchoring and entrenching their already toxic rationalizations of this kind of illiberal, um, unprincipled treatment of things. And so, they don't allow themselves to contend with the alternative narrative or any kind of alternative way of constructing reality other than through their authorized narrative that has all the double down rationalization woven into it. And so they have this kind of perverse incentive to continually cover up their bad faith. And in some sense, their bad faith, obviously, they can cover this up through creating a specious rationalization, sort of always in the immediate, and usually by essentially vilifying the other side or by calling the other side a name or something like that. Because essentially they're in a sympathy grift. They're in a sympathy. Sympathy is their commodity for trust, is their trust token that they're trying to maximize. And that's the kind of glue that holds together all the cognitive dissonance, that overlooks the fact that they've never actually made a proper substantive case. They've never actually met the threshold where essentially their line of reasoning would permit one to reasonably break the liberal order or to transgress over the basic liberal protections and rights and structures. And so they have so at some point, it becomes glaringly obvious that things are just so disjointed from reality and have been warped into this reality tunnel that supports essentially a kind of an ongoing rationalization uh, of what is essentially a kind of a convenient narrative that's supposed to be convenient at providing expediency, but in some sense, because you're doubling down in trying to conserve that convenience, uh, you never actually properly test whether or not the so-called expediency is actually finding its intended purport, or that it's hitting the target. And so it has this kind of built-in self-deceptive dishonesty, um, which in some sense will always lend itself towards the kind of the lowest common denominator, sympathy pulling kind of fascistic narrative. And this is why you can't even a little bit play in identity politics, because if you play a little bit, essentially you're always going to be outshone by the genuine article that is actually embracing the bad faith in all of its self confirming conveniences, if I can put it like that, and using this kind of psychological apparatus in its broadest uh, ability to deflect and sort of self-insulate itself from criticism or needing to substantiate itself, which again, is fundamentally enjoining people into this relativistic sort of gainsaying trust brinksmanship, and so now I just want to broaden this topic slightly and criticize democracy. And I've criticized democracy before, um, and I've had problems articulating it. I think I'm going to articulate it better than I did before, although that sounds like a line that I've said before as well. Is that, look, I'm not going to. I think democracies can certainly work on paper. You have to have, or within the context of it having integrity and it being sort of consistent with a culture that has integrity. But essentially, democracies can't be the fundamental framework of society. An open liberal democracy is fundamentally impossible for it to be a democracy, a pure democracy. An open liberal democracy must be a republic foremost. Justice must be grounded and anchored within the republic, not within the democracy. Otherwise, you can't have a liberal open democracy. You have to solve for the liberal intolerance paradox. And in some sense, democracy having a check on the power of government obviously doesn't solve for the liberal intolerance paradox. You need something deeper than that. Obviously, the Constitution performs that function, uh, or a constitutional supremacy in a republic performs that function. But also, you need a robust and deep legal system that isn't essentially at the mercy of being gerrymandered by democratic influence, that has the rigor to conserve its own basic values and standards and principles and rules, so that essentially the democracy, and essentially you wouldn't need this if the culture, if people were on the ball, if people were democratically, let's say, incredibly astute and literate and attentive to what's going on, um, then perhaps you could just have a democratic check on things. But, I would argue that the country that had the most opportunity, essentially, to see if this kind of solution could work is America. And I think that America does not work for this reason, is that it relies way too heavily on the democracy um, as a check on abuse of power. And that essentially means that the only thing that you're ever going to get a response to is egregious high level thresholds of trespassing from politics into the corruption, or at least that essentially all these things become fuzzy, that essentially you don't have a proper rigorous legal system. You have something that works and that's kind of good enough, and if it's not good enough, then maybe there'll be a kind of democratic um, representation to kind of try to do a job at improving it. So it just becomes this kind of relative evolutionary process of, uh, within some limits, just kind of keeping an eye on things, keeping a check on things, but with very crude metrics. When the law does really require a much more robust and rigorous system in order to preserve something like accountability and transparency, and that justice is seen to be done. Now, in some sense, a lot of the culture has corrupted, and the politics has corrupted to such an extent where it doesn't even matter if justice is seen to be done or not. That's not the standard at all. It's just a kind of proto-fascistic standard of maximizing some kind of sympathy in aid of the continual rationalization of some rabbit hole, of some reality tunnel vortex. Um, so, what can I say about this? What can I say about this? I was gonna. So I mean, it, this is going to maybe be like a bit of a radical shift in topic, but I'm going to talk about something which I think is kind of thematically relevant to this, which is that in South Africa, affirmative action is mentioned in the constitution, and government has a power to make policy. Um, and disadvantage is specifically cited, and it says groups of disadvantaged persons can be identified for policy intervention in some form of affirmative action, which is essentially there to enhance equality. That is how it is constitutionally, morally framed. Is that these things are to for the promotion and the enhancement of equality. Now, I just want to say that I mean I don't want to get too complicated into this because it would require me to have the words out and to link certain things. But what this actually means in practice, in some sense, and this is how affirmative action would be properly done, is that affirmative action should actually be illegal for any non-governmental policy. No private institution should be able to really use affirmative action on the basis of race. Only the government should be allowed to do that, essentially. And I think that this is outlined in the Constitution. The government can make such policy, only the government. And what the government has effectively done, it has outsourced this function to the private sector. It's made policy essentially requiring companies to perform affirmative action instead of doing what it should do, which is essentially be the bridge between, so if essentially what government has to do is that it has to hire or develop programs, hire private companies to empower people, to actually empower people, to identify recipients of some program that will then receive some training or skills or material support that will essentially bridge the gap between being disadvantaged and being empowered. And it will actually have to bridge that gap. That's the work of affirmative action. And only the government should do this. And this is the beautiful thing about only the government doing it, is that then you can still have in the private sector a perfect, well, I mean, it's never a perfect meritocracy, which is essentially good as well, because I mean, this is how small businesses actually allow the economy to grow, is that, they will have relationships that develop, on a kind of micro scale in terms of human capital investment. Small businesses in growing economies are so important, and how they incubate skills is so important. But essentially, all of this has been corrupted by essentially mandates and quotas and red tape. That you don't have authentic credentials anymore in the private sector. You don't have, you essentially have an ideological trust that subverts the establishment of actual integrity. And so, we've got a toxic racial consciousness that has been cultivated by this poisonous ideology, which should never, it's actually unconstitutional, because the government should have to craft policy and it should have to implement that policy. It should not have passed the buck to the private sector. It should have been the one tasked for creating programs and then actually saying if these programs work or not, rather than just constantly scapegoating the system for its constitutional mandate. Now, although technically you could say it is framed generally, that I think the phrasing is something like the government may take measures and policy to do this. Obviously, measures and policy that passes the buck would still count as some kind of policy and some kind of measure that has been taken. But when you understand the special role that the government has been given in this particular constitutional mandate to ameliorate disadvantage, and when you have policy that is essentially a booby trap, which is essentially a way to divert blame and accountability onto, well, whatever you want, whatever representative you want to. I mean, white monopoly capital essentially is the wife, is the marriage partner of the black economic empowerment that we have in this form. And essentially requiring people to do these kinds of racialist quotas and mandates that are placed by government onto companies is an abrogation of the basic value of non-racialism, as well as a very strange and profound penetration of the liberal order in terms of freedom of association and freedom of contract. And you could also say freedom to sort of to pursue a living, and I can't remember exactly how the. By the way, there are also a lot of laws that get in the way of people's ability to sort of to conduct business, essentially, which is essentially a constitutional right. Sort of, if you want to be a massage therapist, you can't just tell people that you are an unlicensed or an uncertified one. You have to, it's all done by regulation, and these things, I think, these things essentially also break the liberal order. But essentially, where you've already taken the citizenry to be an infant, a kind of that government has this infantilism over the individual, to legislate their morality, to legislate their decision making, their discerning over choices of who to hire for their business. It's sort of, this is invasive on a scale which is really quite insidious. It's really quite wicked and evil. In some sense, it legislates a kind of morality that is directly welded to this collectivist group guilt category, moral conflation into the category of the identity. I mean, it's basic proto-fascism, but essentially by compelling non-governmental policy and non-governmental structures to use a racialist test. I mean, even to not actually have a test for disadvantage, but just to have a color bar, essentially, in terms of quotas, or color quotas, I guess you could call it that. But I mean, I don't see how it's any morally distinct against, or I don't see how it's any meaningfully different from the color bar. The only excuse that it has is that it has good intentions, essentially. But the most sort of democratically toxic thing about this is that the policy itself can always deflect criticism against it onto the entire system. It can just divert, it can just exacerbate its own doubling down, its own further rationalization of itself. So, sort of, the more it fails, the more it can demand further. Further radical dispensation of itself. So its failure is the fuel of its own escalation. When it's never properly substantiated itself in the first place. And so, you actually have to you have to do a legal test to extract the actual rationale, the actual substantiation of it, and then you have to test that against the values and the structure set up in the Constitution. And essentially, I think when you do that, it becomes very clear that the only agency that can perform affirmative action is essentially an agency where the buck stops with government, because otherwise you are conflating government with the morality of the citizenry, and essentially the failure of your policy just becomes an accusation against the identity matrix or something like that, or the matrix in identity politics. So anyway, this obviously is very satisfying for ideologues to play this game, because it's sort of um, it's a win-win, because essentially if they lose if they create failing, then essentially they're being disruptive of an evil system, and it shows that essentially that because the system doesn't do well in conjunction with their sociological control and their moral program. Um, it's sort of, you get these wonderful things that Trump coined. So the cure can't be worse than the disease. It's sort of that's where it sort of it fails so much. Um, But essentially, you can't make that. That's not the comparison to make. The comparison to make is that they never substantiated their case properly to begin with. But in America, the problem is that the test was always democracy. The test was not actually the justice system, because the justice system is just a byproduct of the political democracy at work, the ongoing American experiment. They never had the rule of law. Their law was always to be repromulgated. It is applied evenly, but the substance of the law is not consistent. The substantive tenet of the law is not permanent. Therefore, they don't have real general laws of general application. That is really what makes something truly the rule of law, is that you have laws of general application. And the substantive law in America is an experiment that goes on and on and on. You need to actually have a complete law in principle, and then you can refine legal tests after that, but you have to have a law that is complete in principle. Otherwise, you can't have the rule of law. It's not possible. It's just essentially a dalliance, a guise for the rule of man and for accountability, trickery, and sort of narrative witchcraft. Uh, you know, you have to get law almost down to a science that's not scientific in the sense that it's perfect. It's scientific in the sense that it's good enough at conserving itself, conserving what it bars, and conserving its own values, and solving the liberal intolerance paradox, so that it just stays there as a mechanism, and that the human condition then has to work around that. And if you want to do things, you can still do the things that you want. you just can't use it. You can't try to get your way by corrupting the law, by institutionally corrupting what is then a permanent, open, liberal, democratic society. That, because essentially, always, if you are such a corrupt political force and your society is failing, and you want to scapegoat open, liberal democracy, in some sense, the problem is that that's only happened in South Africa, because the rest of the world, it can't really happen because they never had an open liberal democracy on paper. They just had it as propaganda. America, it has it as a promise, as a kind of as you know, but you have to keep on voting for it in a very active sense, because it's still in the process of being experimentally unfolded or something like that, because it's fundamentally the rule of law, the rule of man, not the rule of law. Because the rule of, or the law in America is just, are not laws of general application. When they are enforced, they are enforced essentially according to due process, but due process does not the rule of law make. You need real laws of general application, which only happens when you have a rigorous enough, substantive enough legal system and legal basis. Uh, a basis from which to and when this is done, this means that the state is bounded. You can still do nice things within the democracy. You can still try to have some forms of socialized democracy if you wanted to within such a system, but it would have to keep to certain substantive limits in terms of, you wouldn't be able to outlaw private competition to some degree. You could try to have something like a single payer, but you wouldn't be able to outlaw people working outside of your system, and so, you know, you have to make government policy that essentially that people can opt out of. Um, Somewhat in principle that they can opt out of, at least in where it involves essentially formalizing the access to a particular fundamental constitutional right. The government can't put essentially uh, red tape around fundamental rights and create ad hoc conditions and limitations, except if they are justified within a limitations clause, and where the actual arguments that can be levied against one another have to be properly reasoned out as to if the threshold has been met, in which it's reasonable to limit someone's right. And so, the lines are clearly drawn, and it's very clear the kinds of arguments that are needed to be made in order to defeat potential infringements of constitutional rights. And so you have a system there where the democracy is not the king, where the rule of law is the king, and therefore accountability and an actual maturity is capable of happening, because you live in a republic foremost, and you live within the justice of the republic, and so does the democracy. The democracy becomes subject to the justice of the republic. And if people fail to do that, then they deserve the rule of man, and they deserve the consequences of the rule of man. And in some sense, exactly this ideological fire that is burning things deserves what it ignites, to burn up because it was dead anyway. It was false trust. It had no integrity. But the South African Constitution must preserve. I mean, I say that on my own part, um, prescriptively. It is a necessary moral. It is. It is the solution to every. I mean, it's a space-age constitution. I mean, the people who tarnish the South African Constitution, which legally I don't believe that they have the capacity to do so, but obviously that's an argument that they can, that history can um, make mincemeat of and just devour. But it will be interesting to see if the South African Constitution will preserve. The Bill of Rights has never been amended. Section 1 and Section 2 has never been amended. I don't believe it can be amended without going through the limitations clause, and I don't think that any reduction in any of the protections can actually the meet the standards set in the limitations clause. An act of parliament is an amendment. An amendment of the Constitution is an act of parliament. That is something that must be read consistent with the Constitution, and the test for inconsistency is in the limitations clause. The only infringement of the Constitution has to be in terms of the limitations clause. So you have to run the limitations clause against the amendment. Otherwise, you have a performative contradiction that you don't live in a constitutional supremacy. You cannot measure the power of amendment which is granted in the Constitution to the Parliament. You can't read that as being contradictory to the limitations clause. You have to read them in unison. You have to read the Constitution not piecemeal, but as if it makes a coherent moral corpus. And if you read it holistically, then you come to the reasonable conclusion that amendment can be made to the Constitution, but only by addition, not by subtraction. And those who wish to subtract it should be jailed for attempted constitutional damages, or should at the very least lose their positions in public life. I mean, constitutional damages should be on the same rank as a crime of dishonesty. Attempted constitutional damages should be ranked on par with a crime of dishonesty. And if you have a conviction of a crime of dishonesty, you are not fit to hold public position. Fascist politicians and illiberal anti-constitutional propaganda generating politicians cannot be granted license. I mean, they can spew their anti-constitutional views in private, but they can't do so in public. Essentially, they can't, what is essentially, incite constitutional damages against groups of people or other people, or it's a form of public violence. But in some sense, when they do so, I mean, they are declaring war against the Constitution, which they have done so openly and gleefully as well. They have done so in some campaigning uh, at some times. I mean, these things are fundamentally unlawful. I mean, for example, freedom of expression does not extend to propaganda for war. How is this not propaganda for war when you are declaring war against the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land? You know, when someone is declaring war on the supreme law and there is no defense because the judges themselves have been politically appointed to betray the Constitution and betray it and to read it in piecemeal and to semantically tear it apart. So, you know, we have an institutional corruption of the law. All these things are failing. We have the South African Human Rights Commission, which is ironic in its function and in what it does, or in its ideological contingent of what it does. You have a public protector whose office is essentially also there to extend the reach of this racialist ideology. Um, we live through dark times, and we have not seen someone raise in the political space a proper moral polemic against this kind of institutionalized corruption. Sad. But as I said, it must not be lost, even if it is lost in the corporation of South Africa. Perhaps it shall not be lost in the new South Africa, which exists only for those people. Whoever saw it for themselves and experienced it and inhabited it. And then it was sort of crowded out, or barred, or locked up, or betrayed, stabbed in the back. And no one is really raising this moral point directly.